Hello and welcome to the podcast. A couple of weeks ago, GB News was jubilant about its victory over the broadcasting regulator Ofcom. It posted this story on its website. GB News has comprehensively won its judicial review of TV regulator Ofcom's decisions that two shows hosted by Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg breached the broadcasting code. In a landmark ruling, the High Court found that Ofcom's conclusions that the broadcasts of May the 9th and June the 13th breached the code's due impartiality and content regulations were unlawful. The historic judgment is the first time the broadcasting watchdog has lost a judicial review in relation to the broadcasting code. The channel was also awarded costs. GB News Chief Executive Officer Angelos Frangopoulos said, "This landmark decision by the High Court vindicates GB News' position as the fearless defender of free speech in the United Kingdom." It was undoubtedly humiliating for the regulator. On the 13th of March, Ofcom withdrew the three other breach decisions against GB News and said it was reviewing and consulting on proposed changes to the broadcasting code. It is expected to meet this week to discuss these issues. Well, to unpick what all this means, we're delighted to welcome back to the podcast Professor Stewart Purvis, former content regulator at Ofcom and a former editor of Channel 4 News and a former ITN Chief Executive. He's also a Vice President of the Royal Television Society, and I'll be asking him about the Society's decision to withdraw an award it was making to journalists in Gaza. Stewart Purvis, welcome back to the podcast. Before we get into the detail of this GB News Ofcom argument and the judgment, why, for the wider public, why does it matter? What is at stake here?
Well, I think what's at stake is the future of broadcast journalism. I mean, it sounds a little grand, but effectively we've had a regime of impartiality, basically because Parliament wanted it. And it is creaking, the system is creaking, and I think the judgment is very specific about where the system is creaking. And we need to decide whether we're going to resolve some of the issues which have arisen or just let it roll in the slightly ramshackle way it is at the moment.
Now, the decision by the judge in the case of GB News versus Ofcom seems to have come down to the fact she didn't express a view on any of the principles involved, but it seemed to be about the fact that she said that Ofcom's interpretation of its own advice was wrong. Is that correct?
Well, there's 117 paragraphs of it. I mean, can I give you my go at kind of what she was getting at? Rewind to 2021. We had the launch of GB News, and immediately we have presenters expressing strong personal political views and interviewing guests who by and large agree with them. Some of us say, is that allowed? And Ofcom says there's not a problem. 2023, they use 5 Conservative MPs, sitting MPs, to present programmes. Some of us say, but the Ofcom code says politicians can't present news programmes. Ofcom says, these are not news programmes, they're current affairs programmes. March 2023, Jacob Rees-Mogg on 2 occasions handles breaking news within his current affairs programme. One is a court case in the States involving Trump. One is the murder of students in Nottingham. On both occasions, he does nothing partial, but he is, as a presenter, as a politician, handling breaking news. So the issue is, if this was a current affairs programme, at the moment he did those 2 things, read out that breaking news, interviewed that reporter in Nottingham, had he suddenly become a news presenter, which he couldn't be. And Ofcom basically decided that within a programme, you can move between current affairs and news, but the moment you move into news, politicians can't do that bit. And GB News said, but we're a current affairs programme, you've told us, and all we've done is read out impartially a bit of breaking news. And the judge basically agreed with them and put Ofcom's case down, I thought, pretty directly. You have to remember, this is the first time that Ofcom has ever lost a judicial review on a matter of content. And I think all of us have always assumed that in judicial review, judges do not like overriding the wishes of regulators. So that's why it's quite a big deal.
And as a result of that, Ofcom have dropped, I think, its proceedings with GB News on a number of other cases. However, it has found GB News guilty and fined them on some separate issues. But essentially, Ofcom's wounded, is drawing back and thinking, what do we do now? GB News is saying, this is a great victory for free speech. When I looked at the judgment, and by heaven, it's not the easiest one to read, it seems to me that the problem relates to the definition of a news programme, that the advice from Ofcom seemed to be that if it's a news programme, these impartiality rules apply. And by defining the programme as a current affairs programme in which news may happen, that's where they've got themselves into trouble. Is that right?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And the judge was pretty much astonished at the idea that you could start a programme in one regulatory regime and halfway through it kind of morph to another one and then sort of morph back. And she said a programme cannot be a news programme and a current affairs programme at the same time. Now, the immediate issue that raises is what about this breed of news programming that I think some of us have described as hybrid, of which I would include the Today programme, the PM programme, Newsnight, Channel 4 News, the rolling news on Sky and BBC, which at some points have the characteristics of what Ofcom would say was news and sometimes have the characteristics of current affairs. Which regulatory regime are those programmes now working under? I mean, I've appeared on some of them and I've said to the presenter, when they've raised issues, well, is this a news or a current affairs programme? They look blankly and say, what on earth are you talking about? That's a reasonable point.
Well, they are hybrid, aren't they? And I think what's surprising to me is this seems as much an issue of incompetence by Ofcom as it is of principle. But a way out of this would have been to say, a way out of it for GB News to deal with this was to, when a news item comes up, have a newsreader in the studio. You cut away, the newsreader does their bit, you come back. So you separate a current affairs show, but with news in it, and you separate the two, obviously, and the audience knows when the news is being presented, it's being done to a certain impartial standard, and when the current affairs programme is being presented, in the case of GB News, you're in territory on the right wing of the Tory party heading towards reform. But that's a simple, pragmatic solution.
Well, that is effectively what GB News has done while the court case is on. So on the one hand, they're saying this is a massive freedom of expression. On the other hand, they actually solved the problem by doing it a different way anyway. So, to a certain extent, I think the problem is with this whole story is that it's a danger of being too focused on the issue of politicians presenting programmes, and it's too focused on the issue of GB News. And really, it needs to be a wider and a broader debate. So actually, I welcome the announcement by Ofcom that they are going to consult on the issue. I suspect their hope is it will be a consultation just about this very narrow issue, or these two very narrow issues. And I think that would be a missed public interest opportunity. I think they have got to address this issue of hybrid programmes, but they've also got to discuss, do we want more or less opinionated news programmes in Britain? That's the big debate I would like to start.
And in practice, actually, that means, do we want more right-wing opinionated programmes? Because theoretically, you could have left-wing. But when you look at these programmes, you look at GB News and you look elsewhere, they tend to be funded by rather rich organisations or individuals, people who've run hedge funds, whatever, people who are very firmly committed to the minimum of government interference in everything. And so, in effect, having more opinionated channels will mean having more right-wing opinionated channels, which hardly, if you like, gives the audience the full spectrum of political thought.
Well, that you're absolutely right. If you look at the most recent accounts of GB News, the investors, particularly Sir Paul Marshall, are down £100 million. Those are the losses so far. Now, if you go to America, on the other hand, you see the financial success of Fox News, and you also see that MSNBC, which is the left liberal alternative to Fox News, has actually got a big investment project on at the moment. Now, the owners of MSNBC are Comcast, who also own Sky News. So, theoretically, we could say Comcast saying, well, why aren't we showing MSNBC in the UK? Why don't we create a British version of MSNBC? So it could be that you're right. We've seen these channels as people with deep pockets want to indulge their political philosophies, but there could be a case in the future where there is a business case. We haven't yet seen it yet in the case of GB News, but there could be a business case for a left-leaning channel as well as another right-leaning channel.
And then there would be pressure on the government, I think, to ensure that foreign owners, certainly with connections to foreign governments, should not be allowed anywhere near this. Do you think, we remember Russia Today, of course, from that perspective, do you think the rules are now clear enough to ensure that foreign governments of whatever nature don't have a backdoor into this country to invest in our broadcasting and exploit, if you like, these opportunities for impartial impartial news as they would see it, but I would see it extremely partial news and current affairs?
No, I don't think the rules are that clear on this issue. I mean, they obviously in the Daily Telegraph case, there has been a very specific government process. But I think in the whole issue of the international channels which Ofcom regulates, that I think is another area arising from this. Remembering that on the Sky platform particularly, you see a whole range of voices coming in from around the world. Many of them are from channels which are state funded, and they are attempting to follow the Ofcom rules. This version of the Ofcom's current interpretation of the rules would, it seems to me, allow those channels to become more interventionist, if you like, in British politics than they have been so far.
So in a sense, I think what I get from your conversation is, of course, it's vitally important that Ofcom reviews the situation, as it's going to do very, very shortly, as we understand, and clarifies its rules. But you're suggesting that don't get obsessed with the BBC Charter as the major issue facing broadcasting in the future. This issue of impartiality should be front and centre.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I tell you one thing that happened during my time on the Channel 4 board, which I think will surprise some people? There was a moment, and we're going back a few years, but certainly in the last decade, when Channel 4 News, under its management at the time, was putting out material online that it was not showing on Channel 4 News on television. And I sort of queried that and said, were Channel 4 following the broadcasting code online, even though we didn't have to? In other words, were we operating the same regime across both platforms? And the answer is, we do not want to rule out the possibility that at some point we would like to operate something online that does not meet the broadcasting code. And it goes to the point again, is there a business opportunity here for something that does not meet the broadcasting code? Now, I should stress that was the management of the time, and I managed to push back and got the support of the Channel 4 board. I have no information that the current management of Channel 4 or Channel 4 News have anything in mind, but it would surprise some people to think that Channel 4, as a public service broadcaster, might have even been thinking that at some point they wanted to run a non-impartial news service.
That is remarkable. I hadn't heard that before. Of course, the problem with all of this is that if you provide news for the consumer on a purely commercial basis, as you know, actually, because back in the days of ITN, you tried to run a news service throughout the day. The revenue doesn't follow impartiality. It tends to follow strong personalities, bias, and opinion. And in some instances, and some would say this of GB News, certainly of Case America, by making ordinary people, there's a conspiracy by the broadcasting establishment against them, and we are the only people who are telling you the truth. And so they're out to conspire against you, and we're on your side. Hence, the revenue tail, if you like, is wagging the dog.
But to go back to your almost the starting point of your last question, it makes the BBC more and more and more important. Because I think, the only thing I think one can be reasonably confident of is that the BBC would always, for its own reasons, want to be impartial, partly to justify a version of the licence fee.
Yeah, and its uniqueness, it becomes the big selling point. Well, when we're on this subject, the BBC obviously is in trouble over the Gaza programme, but there have been a number of knock-on effects of that. And one of them was the decision of the Royal Television Society to well, you'll tell me whether to postpone or withdraw an award, a special award given to journalists in Gaza. Now, you're a vice president of the Royal Television Society. You're chair of the Television Journalism Awards. Just say briefly, I was a judge on one of the awards this year, but not in this area. The award has been withdrawn. Why?
Well, as I understand it, and I should say that during my time as the chairman of the awards panels, I realised how risk-averse the RTS was to any controversy, particularly because of the word royal in the title. And as a result of that, they, I think, became sensitive to the controversy about the Gaza program. Now, of course, the Gaza program was a documentary. It was not connected with the awards in any way. It wasn't put in for an award because it wasn't actually eligible for an award. So there was no connection. As I understand it, the moment that people became aware that actually there was a connection between this documentary and Channel 4 News' coverage of Gaza, that the people who made the program may have discovered this young man who was a son of somebody who worked for Hamas. They discovered him whilst working for Channel 4 News and then said to the BBC, look, we found this kid, you could use him. That's when the organisers at the RTS said, oh, there's a bit more to this than we thought. Look, you can make your own judgment about that was right or wrong. What I would hope would come out of this was that as soon as we've got some clarity about whether there is any connection at all between what happened at the BBC documentary and the entrance for the RTS Awards, and particularly the rightful winners of this special award, that those Gaza journalists should get an award. That's the bottom line out of this. Let's get through all this kerfuffle and let's go back and reward the people who deserve an award.
Well, as you'll know, there are a large number of 400 journalists and others have complained to the RTS and asked for transparency, which they haven't got yet. And it's a reasonable request, even if you disagree with the judgment. But, of course, the background to this is that the Committee for the Protection of Journalists say that 171 journalists and media workers have been killed in Gaza. Nobody denies the level of destruction. But another thing that has come up, as well as the complaints of people like Jonathan Dimbleby and whatever, is the fact that according to a statement from the Jewish Board of Deputies President Phil Rosenberg spoke today, this is on the 6th of March, to the RTS CEO Theresa Wise. We welcome the fact that the RTS has confirmed that it will now be looking at its criteria and its processes. Now, that is immediately after, I think, the RTS decided to withdraw the award. So it's not a case of the Board of Deputies go, they lobby RTS, the RTS pulls it. No, but obviously the Board of Deputies are rather pleased by this. And the fact is, there's a propaganda war going on, isn't there? And do you think the RTS can avoid being part of that? Because the result of trying to stay outside altogether is that it can't, almost any regime, you can imagine undercover people in China, undercover people in Russia. There's a complaint about what they've done, and people who have been going to prison round the world and being killed round the world suddenly don't get acknowledged because of complaints made by the very authorities that are trying to suppress the news.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first I'd heard of it, Roger. I do not understand why they would need to look at the processes, because I can't see why there would be a connection between the documentary and the processes, because the documentary wasn't involved in the awards. But I think the RTS should say, when we have got to the bottom of the facts, we will then decide whether it is still appropriate to give an award. And if there is no, let's use a strange word, contamination, if you like, if there is no read across from the issue of the documentary to the awards, then the award to the Gaza cameraman should go ahead.
But as the Vice President of the RTS, you are saying it should be more transparent on this issue.
I absolutely, it should set out a process for how it is going to resolve what happens to that award.
Can I just finally talk about something the chairman of the BBC, Samir Shah, said when he was being talking to, it sounded more like cross-examination by a House of Commons Select Committee. And in terms of he promised that when the present troubles have died down, there would be a review carried out. I think they call it an impartiality review. They call it a thematic review of Middle East coverage. Some cynics say that this is a way of kicking everything into the long grass as they do, but you have experience of such a review, don't you?
Yes, it's almost 20 years ago that I was a member of a panel of so-called experts asked to review the BBC's coverage of Israel-Palestinians conflict, and I actually went to Israel with the rest of the panel, and actually I went to Gaza and met and visited the BBC office in Gaza with the correspondent Alan Johnson, who was later kidnapped for a time. So I've seen the kind of emotions and the raw emotions that there are. And I have to say, in Israel, I was at the time, and it is 20 years ago, but it shows you how long this issue has been going on. I was staggered at the animosity towards the BBC by, particularly amongst the settler community. I actually agreed to speak at a university in a settlement. And I kept saying, look, I'm an independent person who's inquiring into the BBC coverage. I mean, tell me what you think. And all I got was abuse. Basically, you're the BBC, get out of here, sort of stuff. So that was something I take away. I also was really struck talking to the BBC members of the Arabic staff in the Gaza office about their personal strength of views about Israelis and about the terms they used about Israelis. That was a bit of a shock to me. So it was very much a very vivid experience. I have to say that I found the experience fascinating. I think the report was just shelved. I think the only one thing I can say about it with some positivity is that we wondered if we couldn't expect to hear more often from Jeremy Bowen, who was then the Middle East editor. I don't think anyone now could ask anything more of Jeremy Bowen.
No, but unfortunately, Jeremy is accused of being, by certain members of the Jewish community in this country and by the Israeli government, of being hopelessly biased. Not my view at all. We see in the Daily Telegraph, Danny Cohen, a former director of television of the BBC, saying the BBC is institutionally anti-Semitic. We've had Melanie Phillips calling it the Hamas broadcasting organisation, and we have plenty of people who are in support of the Palestinian case thinking the BBC is hopelessly biased. The Israeli government, of course, as always, but this particular government ruthlessly, it seems to me, sees most criticism, or says most criticism, is anti-Semitic. And I think what strikes me, there are two dangers here, aren't there? The first is that journalists think this, as some felt about Northern Ireland in the 70s. Look, this is a no-win situation for us. Can we? I found people when I was editor of Panorama at the end of the 70s reluctant to go to Northern Ireland. We found people. The danger here is journalists just withdraw. Is that a real worry?
I don't think so. In my experience, there are. The level of enthusiasm from journalists to be on the spot, to be eyewitnesses, was undiminished, and it's certainly my time. And I would hope that hasn't changed. I just think that the fear that, as you say, they're going to be attacked from all sides is going to make them more and more cautious, I suppose. And because sometimes we want a proper level of caution, but we want a proper level of eyewitness reporting as well. So that would be my concern.
Which would be greatly helped if Israel would allow independent journalists into Gaza, which it does not.
Yes, but I think it's also fair to say that we don't often get the reminders of the controls that Hamas is putting on the reporting done by Gaza journalists. Yeah. I think we could do with a few more of those as well.
As you would expect people operating in Russia and China and whatever to say, these are the conditions that we're operating under, these are the questions we'll not be able to ask you. The usual, yes, they should be there. But the thing that also strikes me, but I commit from more of a current affairs point of view, is that current affairs is failing to explore some of the most important issues, which are when, one of them to my mind anyway, is when does criticism of Israel morph into anti-Semitism? And I think it's one of the key questions that is rarely, if ever, examined. And I think it needs to be, because a lot of people, because we're in a propaganda war, because conspiracies are all around, but because journalists themselves often are so taken up by the immediacy of the situation that they begin to use terms or whatever that the public doesn't understand and haven't been explored. I felt this, declare my own prejudices, on the Brexit debate, not because which way they should go, but concepts such as sovereignty and what that meant in the 21st century were not explored by any programme. So do you think this? I look for across the spectrum now of programming to say who is going to ask questions and explore issues such as when does criticism of Israel morph into anti-Semitism? When is it legitimate to call members of the Israeli cabinet racists, like Mr. Ben-Gvir? Because he talks about various people as being almost subhuman, and has actually an Israeli court has convicted him, as it happens, of racism. Do you think that's missing from our contemporary debate?
Yes, I think it is. And it's an issue, obviously, came up during Jeremy Corbyn's time in the Labour Party, and the issue of the definition of anti-Semitism. All I would say is it's yet another issue in the Gaza documentary that the BBC has to, I think, clarify is the translations, which appear to,
yes,
in which the word it is suggested that the people interviewed or featured in the programme used the word Jew, and that was translated as Israeli. That goes to the issue in a different way, and I think the BBC needs to explain what happened there as well. So, yes, I mean, the only programme I can think of that I might expect to do it is that the Sunday programme on Radio 4 on a Sunday morning, which Edward Sturton's sort of religious current affairs programme, but it does justify a place in a more mainstream news agenda, I think.
Well, Stewart Purvis, thank you very much for talking to us again, and I hope we'll talk to you again in future, and we'll encourage the RTS to be more transparent, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Our thanks to Stewart Purvis, former content regulator at Ofcom and a former editor of Channel 4 News and a former ITN Chief Executive. Now, for less than the price of a cup of coffee each month, you can support our journalism, and please do consider doing so. You can do this by either a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month. By signing up to Patreon, this will also entitle you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. The link to this and our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. That's it for this week, and as you probably know, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.